What if an F-15 went back in time to World War II? Well, with the joy of modelling, we can explore such a fictional eventuality. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minute, and join me today as I build this, the Academy US Air Force F-15 in 1:144 scale, but this time with a slight twist. Not using the decal scheme inside the box, I'll be painting it in a fictional what if D-Day colour scheme. Let's get into it. So this idea actually came about from a group of modelling channels here on YouTube, and we're doing a sort of buddy build. The idea being that we all build an F-15 in some shape or form, but with one catch. We're not allowed to use the decal schemes included in the box. I wanted to take part but didn't want to do anything too complicated, so I went for this rather small 144th scale kit. I'll pop a link to all these lovely people taking part so you can check out their particular videos when they come out. For now though, let's get this one down onto the workbench. I haven't actually done an unboxing video on this particular kit, but there's not a great deal in here, so let's just take a quick look. The outside of the box has a reasonably attractive image of the F-15 and is to the normal format for the small kits from Academy. Inside the box we are faced with a single sheet of instructions which are printed in black and white. I'm not a big fan of black and white instructions as it makes it difficult to understand the painting schemes. After all, there are only so many shades of grey. The exploded diagrams are relatively simple though, and the kit doesn't look too complicated to complete. The kit does include some transfers, and whilst they don't look to be the worst that I've seen from Academy, they do seem a little thick. As mentioned though, I'm not using these, so I'll put them to one side and keep them for a future project. Looking at the plastic parts, we get one small clear sprue which features the single canopy component. It's moulded to a reasonably good quality, with raised framework and the minimum of scratches on the plastic. The two grey plastic sprues contain the remaining 21 parts of this kit. On the whole, the mould quality is quite good and there's not that much in the way of flash. The kit does benefit from recessed panel lines, but the detail does seem to be a little soft in places and generally a little questionable at times. As usual though, I'll pop a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things I used if you fancy replicating something similar yourself. The first step in this construction though was to start removing parts from the sprue. I used my side cutters for this and then sanded down any rough areas or excess flash using a sanding stick. I think this kit comes with the option to have landing gear raised by simply gluing the landing gear covers in place. However, mine is going to have the wheels down, so as a result I need to super glue in some liquid gravity on the nose of the aircraft. I'm hoping that if I install enough of this liquid gravity as far forwards as I can, it should prevent it from sitting on its tail when it's finished. Humbrol liquid poly will be my cement of choice during this build. The nose parts were joined together and then the seam was sanded as smooth as I could get it. The upper part of the aircraft was joined to the lower side of the plane. I did have to take a little care to make sure everything was lined up correctly here. When that was done, I glued the nose part onto the fuselage. Following on from this, the vertical tail surfaces were glued into their slots on the aircraft. And then the engine exhaust nozzles were glued at the back of the plane. The front landing gear was glued into its slot, and this was followed by the main landing gear legs. The landing gear doors need to be cut in half. I did this simply by snapping them and then sanding it clean. These separated doors can then be glued into position on the landing gear bays. A small landing gear door is also supplied for the front landing gear leg. Vallejo black was then used to paint the interior cockpit area. There is no internal cockpit detail, so this will have to do. I then masked up the cockpit canopy using my normal method of applying tape and then cutting it along the canopy lines. This was glued into place very carefully using some Humbrol Clear Fix. You do have to take care with this glue as it's a bit stringy and it can be a little messy, but it should dry clear and strong and not react with the plastic. And now it's time to prime. So for this kit I'm using Tamiya Fine White Spray Paint. This was applied in a few thin layers to get a good overall coat. The reason I'm using white is because I want to replicate D-Day stripes, and this is the easiest way I can think of to do it. When that primer was dry, I masked the white stripes on the wings with strips of masking tape. A little more white primer was applied to these areas just to try and prevent any paint bleed underneath the masking tape. Because this is such a small kit, I've decided I'm going to hand paint everything. So here I am using some more Vallejo black to paint the black stripes on the wings. I also thought it would be fun to use enamels for some of these paints, so I've got this very old number 220 Humbrol enamel, which is an Italian red. I used this straight out of the pot and applied it to the nose of the aircraft. A few layers of this paint would be needed, but because it was straight out of the bottle, it would result in an increased drying time. Vallejo gunmetal was carefully painted onto the engine exhausts at the rear of the aircraft. Humbrol 64, which again is another enamel paint, was then painted onto the lower side of the aircraft. This paint scheme is going to replicate those used by various aircraft in the Royal Air Force used during D-Day. Moving on to the upper surfaces, I'd use Humbrol 106 Ocean Grey, again another enamel, for the first colour of the camouflage scheme. Although I've mixed these paints quite thoroughly, I haven't actually thinned them down. I'm using them straight out of the tins to see what sort of results I can get, but in hindsight this is probably not the best idea. They are coming out a little blotchy, but hopefully that increased drying time should prevent any brushstrokes from being visible. Once again, a number of thin coats would be needed for the opacity of this colour. To complete the camouflage scheme on the top of the aircraft, I'm using Humbrol 30, which is dark green. This was simply applied using my own sort of idea of what a camouflage scheme would look like if applied to an F-15. I did actually mask certain areas of the aircraft to ensure I had nice straight lines, and whilst the paint is still a little wet because, let's face it, it's going to have a very long drying time, I ended up removing this masking tape. On the whole, it's done a reasonable job, but there are some areas which I'll have to touch up. After a day or so of leaving these paints to cure, I then gave the entire aircraft a coat of satin varnish from the Army Painter range. This should help even out the finish and give a good surface for the decals I'm going to use. And speaking of the decals, I've got this set of extra transfers from Beacon Models. This was actually a pre-order bonus for their Spitfire and BF-109 model kits when they were being developed. So I have a couple of these sheets to use, and thought this would be the perfect opportunity. These transfers are printed to a reasonably good quality and are quite suitable for this kind of project. I cut out the transfers that I wanted to use and then soaked them in warm water to allow them to release from the backing paper. I'm going to be using Micro Scale, Micro Set and Sol as my setting solutions for this build. First up, some Micro Set from the blue bottle is brushed onto the aircraft, and then the transfer is carefully slid into place. Once the transfers are all slid into place and have settled onto the surface, some Micro Sol from the red bottle will be applied to help soften them down further onto the surface and look painted on. I left the transfers to cure and then decided that a coat of Humbrol 49 matte acrylic varnish would be a good top surface coat to protect these transfers and dull down that satin shine from before. When that varnish was dry, I glued into place the wheels on the landing gear legs. You can see that I've already painted the tyres in black off camera. The landing gear bays have been kept the white primer colour. I then glued on the 4 missiles that go on the bottom of the aircraft. These have already been painted with number 1 primer grey from Humbrol. When this was done, I carefully removed the masking tape on the canopy and I called my fictional what-if build of this D-Day F-15 complete. So, my idea behind this kit, bearing in mind the brief was you can't use the decal scheme included in the model, I've gone down this fictional road. My idea being that this what if F-15 accidentally somehow went back in time to 1940. I think it would have taken a few years from 1940 for the RAF and the US Army Air Force to reverse engineer some of the technology. I don't think they would have been able to reverse engineer everything, but some of it they may have been able to use. I think if it had landed in the UK in 1940 and they'd reversed engineered it, they may have been able to have it ready for use on D-Day in 1944. Given the technology of the day, I think they may have been able to replicate the airframe, but perhaps with different materials. And the engines could have maybe been replicated, seeing as there was jet engine technology being developed around that time, but again it would have been to a lesser quality. Maybe the aircraft couldn't fly as fast, with a top speed being around the sound barrier. I also think the missiles wouldn't be replicated, due to the fact that the microelectronics inside these things would be much too hard to replicate. They could though be downgraded to be unguided munitions for use against ground targets. I also imagine that the internal guns could have been replaced with some 20mm Hispano cannons or something like that, purely because that would be something they'd have accessible. And I suppose the question would remain, what kind of difference would this have made back in the 1940s? This build coincides with the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and I'm sure it wasn't fun for all those people who had to make sacrifices during that time. So perhaps I could hope this model is some kind of tribute. But as a scale modelling channel, let's also now take a moment to review the model kit. Now I can't do a full review, seeing as I haven't actually built it out of the box as such, especially given that I haven't used the decals, but I can talk about the other areas of the kit. As mentioned at the beginning, I find the instructions to be not the best, but they are easy to follow. This particular model does retail here in the UK at the time I'm making this video for £4, which if anything makes it a perfect pocket money kit. With that in mind, I found the parts did generally fit together well and the level of detail is acceptable for a small kit of this low price. However, eagle-eyed viewers may be able to notice some areas where there are some gaps, particularly around the join where the front of the aircraft joins the fuselage. That's an area that I just didn't really have the capacity to deal with, given that this was such a cheap kit, and I was trying to build this quickly. And speaking of building this quickly, I've checked my book, and you can get some of these journals to help your own modelling on the workbench from my Amazon page, but I checked the book and it says that I took about 5 days to build this one, and I think the main reason was because of the massive drying time due to those enamel paints that I've used. So the enamel paints I used straight out of the pot, and as a result I'm not 100% happy with the finish. I think my reasoning at the time was that I didn't have much in the way of thinners. I've used white spirit before, but I find putting enamel paints on top of other enamel paints with white spirit, it's quite hot and it reacts and it reactivates the paint underneath. I didn't have the thinners that I bought for the ME410 build, because with the magic of YouTube, some projects happen before other ones and videos get edited at different times. I'm glad that the amount of liquid gravity I glued into the nose is actually enough to help prevent it from sitting on its tail, but I did find that the missiles that go underneath the aircraft don't quite sit in the right places. They feel a bit like an afterthought and they sort of point at funny angles. I do think they might be a little bit overscale as well. It is a bit of a shame that there's no cockpit inside this aircraft, but then again, in such a small scale, any cockpit details there would be hard to see from a normal viewing distance. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, you do get the option to glue the landing gear covers in a raised position, but it's a shame that there's no pilot or display stand included to make it look a little more realistic. You're probably wondering about the age of this tooling though, and I think it dates from 1974. From my research, it would seem that it's changed hands to different companies a number of times, so it's a little bit hard to try and keep track of it. But 1974 seems to be the earliest that this kind of kit made an appearance. Which, given the recessed panel lines and the crisp mould details, these are some features you don't normally associate with a model kit of that era. However, now though, it's looking a little dated, and I'm sure some of the proportions of the kit aren't quite right. I'm pretty sure the production date of the particular version I have here dates from around 2010, but I have no doubt in my mind that it's probably a much more recent release and hasn't actually been sat on a shelf somewhere for nearly 15 years. But yeah, on the whole, not a bad kit to build for a pocket money price, especially if you want to mess around and do something different with it. As always, I'd like to take a moment to thank my Model Club members for their extra support, allowing me to pop out on a whim and getting cheap kits to build quickly. A massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them, take a look at the links in the description. I'd like to welcome the latest member to the club, Ryan Griffin. Thanks for your support. Alternatively, if you'd like to support the channel, there are other ways, and you can check out the information underneath the video. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, make sure you check out the other channels who are also taking part in this F-15 with a twist build. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.